The village of Little Daring, tucked snugly between rolling meadows and an ancient oak wood, was the sort of place that seemed immune to the wider world's noise. The church bells still rang each Sunday morning. Mrs. Phelps's shop still displayed barley sugar sticks in the same glass jar she'd had since the Great War, and the women of the village still gathered every Thursday afternoon for tea, knitting, and inevitably a gentle exchange of gossip. It was during one such meeting, on an unusually brisk March afternoon, that Miss Jane Marple found herself seated by the fire at the home of Mrs. Agatha Larkin, the vicar's wife. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and scones just removed from the oven. Outside, the wind tapped at the window panes like an impatient visitor, but inside all was warmth and civility. "Do have another piece of cake, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Larkin, her plump hands busy pouring tea from a silver pot that had seen better days. "You've barely touched your first slice." Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles clicking rhythmically as she worked a row of soft blue wool. "I find, dear Mrs. Larkin, that one mustn't indulge too freely in sweets. They are far less forgiving to the complexion than they once were." Across the table, Mrs. Ruth Penhaligon, the doctor's wife, gave a prim sniff. "Nonsense. A bit of sponge never hurt anyone. It's worry that ages a woman, not cake." That remark invited precisely the sort of conversation these afternoons were known for. Within moments, the women were deep in discussion of worries large and small, the gardener's cough, the new maid's questionable morals, and, inevitably, the arrival of Mrs. Sylvia Dacres, the newest resident of Little Daring. "She's taken rooms at Maple Lodge," Mrs. Larkin said in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "Arrived last month from London, so I hear. A widow, rather stylish, and—" here she lowered her voice, apparently very well off. Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting, but the faintest glimmer of curiosity crossed her blue eyes. "I believe I saw her at the post office," she murmured. "Tall lady, well dressed, with a fur collar that would make most actresses envious." "That's the one," said Mrs. Penhaligon. "My husband swears she reminds him of someone he treated years ago, though he can't place who. I dare say she's rather too polished for our little village." Mrs. Larkin nodded. "There are whispers, of course, about her husband's death. An unfortunate accident, they say, fell down the stairs of their townhouse. Some people think—" "Now, Agatha," Miss Marple said mildly, "you know what happens when one repeats what some people think. It multiplies faster than rabbits." The vicar's wife flushed. "Quite right, Miss Marple, quite right. Only, well, one does wonder about people who move to a quiet place like this so suddenly." Miss Marple gave a small smile and a knowing hum. "Indeed, one does." The evening that changed everything, that same evening, Miss Marple returned to her neat cottage on the high street, where her cat, Sergeant, awaited with imperious expectation. The kettle was soon whistling on the hob, and as she settled into her armchair with a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake, she reflected on the day's conversations. Newcomers to villages were always interesting creatures. They upset the natural rhythm of gossip, introducing new stories where old ones had gone stale. But Mrs. Dacres, there was something unusually deliberate about her arrival, Miss Marple thought, as though she had chosen Little Daring not for its peace, but for its concealment. The next morning the quiet of the village was broken by a flurry of excitement. Mrs. Larkin herself appeared at Miss Marple's gate, out of breath and pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, such a dreadful thing. You've heard, haven't you?" "Heard what, my dear?" "Mrs. Dacres, she's been found dead." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a faint sigh. "Dear me, and she seemed in quite robust health yesterday. How very sad. What happened?" "They say it's her heart, though there's talk she had been out walking by the river late last night. The maid found her this morning. Constable Pratt's there now." Miss Marple rose at once. "Then perhaps we had better call upon Mrs. Dacres' maid. I find that the sooner one learns the facts, the fewer falsehoods must later be untangled." The house by the river Maple Lodge stood on the edge of the village, a handsome brick house framed by weeping willows. It looked innocent enough, though the drawn curtains lent it a mournful air. The front door was answered by Alice, the maid a timid girl of no more than 20, her eyes red from crying. "Oh, miss," she said to Mrs. Larkin and Miss Marple, "it's terrible, just terrible. Mrs. Dacres was so kind to me." "Kindness is a rare virtue," said Miss Marple gently. "But tell us, child, what precisely happened." The girl dabbed her eyes with her apron. She went for her evening walk, as usual, down by the river path. She liked the quiet, she said. "I thought nothing of it till she didn't come back. This morning I found her near the little footbridge. She'd fallen, her head struck a stone." Mrs. Larkin gasped softly. "How dreadful!" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And you are certain she fell?" "Well, that's what Constable Pratt said," Alice replied. "He said it was probably an accident, but—" She hesitated, twisting the corner of her apron. "Yes, my dear, it's just Mrs. Dacres wasn't alone last night. I saw her from the upstairs window talking to someone at the gate. Someone, I couldn't see who, miss. It was dark, but I heard voices, a man's voice." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her knitting fingers twitched ever so slightly, as if they had caught a new thread to follow. The visitors and the village talked by noon. Little Daring was abuzz with rumour. In the post office, at the grocer's, and by the churchyard wall, people repeated the news in ever more dramatic tones. Some claimed it was suicide, others whispered of murder, and among the names mentioned in speculation were several familiar to Miss Marple. There was Colonel Arthur Bristow, retired and proud, who lived 2 cottages down from Maple Lodge and was often seen escorting Mrs. Dacres to the village fete. Then there was Mrs. Elena Carter, whose late husband had apparently known Mrs. Dacres in London, or so she claimed, with that peculiar air of satisfaction gossipers adopt when tragedy lends their stories weight. And finally there was Mr. Lionel Grant, the local solicitor, a handsome man with a reputation for charm and a fondness for bridge games at the Vicarage. He had been seen more than once leaving Maple Lodge at dusk. That evening Miss Marple was invited to dine at the Vicarage, where the small company, including Colonel Bristow and Mr. Grant, gathered to discuss the tragedy in properly subdued tones. Colonel Bristow, his moustache bristling, declared the matter plain. "An accident, of course. The path by the river is treacherous after rain. Dreadful business, but there's an end to it." Mrs. Larkin looked doubtful. "Still, Colonel, the maid said she saw someone speaking with her mistress." The Colonel harumphed. "Village nonsense. These girls see shadows and make stories." Mr. Grant sipped his port with a faint smile. "Perhaps not entirely nonsense, Colonel. Mrs. Dacres did have her share of acquaintances." Mrs. Larkin repeated. Mr. Grant shrugged delicately. "London is full of them. I handled some of her affairs when she settled here. There were certain financial complications, shall we say. She preferred discretion." Miss Marple's eyes lifted at that word. "Discretion is often a very fine veil," she said quietly, "but it does tend to slip at inconvenient moments." The solicitor laughed. "You're quite the philosopher, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all," she replied. "Only an observer, and observation, you know, is the poor man's microscope." Her gentle remark earned a round of polite chuckles, but beneath the laughter she noted the subtle exchange of glances, a flicker of tension between the Colonel and the solicitor, the faint tightening of Mrs. Larkin's smile. The air in the cosy dining-room seemed suddenly fragile, as if one more word might shatter its polite surface. A letter and a clue the following morning brought fresh news. The postmistress, Mrs. Phelps, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, quite flustered. "Miss Marple, I don't like to be involved, but you know how things are. The police came by just now about a letter addressed to Mrs. Dacres. It arrived yesterday after she'd gone." Miss Marple folded her hands. "A letter, you say? From whom?" "That's just it, no return address, but the handwriting's a man's, and it was marked urgent. Constable Pratt took it, of course, but I had a glance. The postmark was London." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet interest. "London? How very suggestive. Perhaps someone from her past decided to renew their acquaintance." Mrs. Phelps sighed. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I think this whole business will bring trouble. People don't just move to Little Daring to fall into rivers." The funeral and the whisper 3 days later. The village gathered in sombre attire for Mrs. Dacres' funeral. The March wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and lilac as the vicar read the familiar words, "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes." Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the small crowd. Her sharp eyes took note of each face. Colonel Bristow standing stiff and red-faced, Mrs. Carter dabbing her eyes too theatrically, Mr. Grant speaking in low tones to a stranger, a man in a dark overcoat, his expression unreadable. When the service ended and the mourners began to drift away, Miss Marple lingered by the gate. The man in the overcoat paused nearby, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Cold day," Miss Marple remarked gently. He glanced at her, startled. Yes, rather. "You were acquainted with Mrs. Dacres?" The man hesitated, in a manner of speaking. "I'm Inspector Cray, Scotland Yard. We had reason to keep an eye on Mrs. Dacres." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Indeed, then her death may not have been quite the accident our village imagines." Cray gave a weary sigh. "That's what I'm here to determine. She was mixed up in some business in London blackmail, to put it plainly. But if she was killed, the person responsible might well be among your respectable neighbours." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, Inspector, in my experience, wickedness is far more comfortable in respectability than anywhere else." He looked at her curiously. "You've a sharp mind, madame. The constable says you're something of a local detective." "Only a knitter of sorts," she replied serenely. "But sometimes, when one is untangling a ball of wool, one finds unexpected knots." Cray smiled faintly. "Then I hope you'll keep knitting, Miss Marple. We may need your help." The calm before the clue that night. Miss Marple sat once again in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village outside slept under a veil of mist, but in her mind the threads of conversation, the maid's frightened voice, the colonel's defensiveness, Mr. Grant's careful charm, the mysterious letter all wove together into something far from peaceful. A chance fall by the river? No, Miss Marple thought, not when a woman like Mrs. Dacres carried secrets, not when someone had been waiting for her at the gate. She leaned back, eyes distant, her cat purring softly by the fire. "There's something in it, Sergeant," she murmured, "something very curious indeed, and I fancy the truth will not be long in showing itself if one knows where to look." Outside, the church clock struck 9. In the stillness that followed, Miss Marple's needles paused for a heartbeat, then resumed their gentle rhythm, as though knitting not wool, but destiny itself. The death of Mrs. Sylvia Dacres might have passed quietly into village legend, a whispered tale of misfortune retold beside teacups, had it not been for Miss Marple's persistent sense that something simply did not fit. In Little Daring, the days after the funeral were calm on the surface, yet the undercurrent of curiosity ran deep. The ladies at the tea shop still knitted, but their tongues, like their needles, moved briskly. Constable Pratt, earnest and inexperienced, walked about with a notebook far too small for the gravity he wished to convey, and above it all Miss Marple watched gently, unobtrusively, as was her way. 1. The constable's confidence. It was 2 days after the funeral, when Constable Pratt called at Miss Marple's cottage. He removed his cap respectfully and cleared his throat. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd just have a word, seeing as you're always observant of things." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Do sit down, Constable. You'll find the chair by the hearth most forgiving. Now you have something on your mind." "Yes, ma'am." He sat, balancing his notebook on his knee. "Inspector Cray's gone back to London for the moment. Says it's likely just an accident. But well, there are some points that don't sit easy with me." "How sensible of you to notice that," Miss Marple said encouragingly. "Which points in particular?" Pratt frowned. The ground by the river-bank was slippery right enough, but there were 2 sets of footprints, one smaller, that'd be hers, and one larger, a man's. Hard to tell whose, what with the mud, but it looked like she weren't walking with him, more like she was facing him. Miss Marple's knitting paused for half a beat. "Facing him, you say? How interesting. And another thing," Pratt went on. "The doctor said she'd been drinking before she went out, not enough to make her drunk, mind, but enough that her balance might have been off." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "unless, of course, someone wished her to appear that way." The young constable looked puzzled. "Beg pardon." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Just an old woman's fancy, my dear. But sometimes one's character can be disguised as easily as one's handwriting with a little deceit." Pratt looked uncertain, but wrote something down all the same. "Right you are, Miss Marple. I'll keep that in mind." As he left, Miss Marple gazed into the fire thoughtfully. "2 sets of footprints," she murmured, "and one of them with rather a large shoe, I fancy. 2. A visit to Colonel Bristow the next afternoon found Miss Marple making her way to Hawthorne Cottage, home of Colonel Arthur Bristow. The Colonel was in his garden, trimming rose-bushes with military precision. "Good day, Colonel," Miss Marple greeted cheerfully. "I thought a little walk might do me good, and one seldom passes Hawthorne Cottage without admiring its roses." He straightened, brushing earth from his gloves. "Ah, Miss Marple, fine day for gardening, eh, though a bit of a chill in the air." "Yes, quite, and yet how peaceful our village seems despite recent sadness." The Colonel's expression tightened. "Terrible business, that. Dacres' death, I mean. But these things happen, Miss Marple. Slippery banks, a misstep, that's all there is to it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "You were acquainted with Mrs. Dacres, were you not?" He cleared his throat. "Acquainted, yes. We played bridge occasionally, nothing more. Perfectly respectable woman." "Oh, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, studying a rose petal between her fingers. "And yet one can't help wondering what brought such a fashionable lady to our quiet corner. London seems a rather large place to leave behind. City life doesn't suit everyone," the Colonel replied briskly. "She told me once she was tired of gossip." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "but gossip has a way of finding us wherever we go, don't you think?" He gave her a sharp look. "Meaning what, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all, Colonel. Only that truth, like a rose, has its thorns, and sometimes we must be careful where we grasp." She thanked him for the visit and walked away slowly, leaving the Colonel frowning after her. 3. The doctor's wife and her stories from Hawthorne Cottage. Miss Marple took the path that led past the doctor's house, where Mrs. Ruth Penhaligon happened to be pruning her own roses with considerably less success. "Miss Marple, you do look well," Mrs. Penhaligon said brightly. "Do come in for a moment. I was just making tea." Inside, the drawing-room smelled faintly of antiseptic and biscuits. Miss Marple took her place on the floral settee, her needles busy even as she spoke. "You must have had a trying week, my dear," she said kindly, "so many people asking your husband's opinion about poor Mrs. Dacres. Oh, indeed, Dr. Penhaligon has hardly had a moment's rest, but he insists there was nothing unnatural about her death." Mrs. Penhaligon lowered her voice. "Still, I can't help thinking she wasn't quite the sort of woman one expected here. London women, they bring trouble, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "And yet you visited her, I believe." "Only once. She called for my husband, something about nerves. She was rather highly strung, poor soul. But if you ask me, she had more than nerves troubling her. She was afraid of someone. Miss Marple, I'm certain of it. Afraid." Miss Marple's tone was quiet but alert. "Did she say who?" "No, she only mentioned that she'd been receiving unpleasant letters. My husband told her to rest and avoid excitement." "How wise of him," said Miss Marple. "But tell me, did she mention any friends here, or visitors?" Mrs. Penhaligon thought a moment. "Well, she did have that solicitor fellow, Mr. Grant, calling rather often. Always with papers and such. Quite charming, of course. But you know what they say about charming men." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "I do. For the solicitor's office later that week, Miss Marple paid a polite call on Mr. Lionel Grant, whose office overlooked the square. His secretary ushered her in, and the solicitor rose from behind his desk with a smooth smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. How may I be of service?" "Oh, I merely wished to ask a trifle about Mrs. Dacres' affairs," she said mildly. "You see, one hears such conflicting accounts, and I do dislike misunderstandings." "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Mrs. Dacres' affairs were in order, mostly. She had some funds in London investments and such, and she'd been selling a few pieces of jewellery recently. "Perfectly ordinary jewellery," Miss Marple echoed. "Was she in need of money?" He hesitated. "Not exactly. She said she wished to simplify her life, though she did mention paying off an old debt. Curious, that." "Curious indeed," said Miss Marple. "Would this debt have anything to do with London?" Mr. Grant smiled thinly. "You have a keen instinct, Miss Marple, but I'm afraid client confidentiality prevents me from saying more." Quite," she murmured, rising, "but I'm sure Mrs. Dacres would have been grateful to have such a discreet man of business." As she reached the door, Mr. Grant added lightly, "You know, Miss Marple, you have the look of a woman who sees through people." She turned, eyes twinkling. "Only when they insist on being looked at, Mr. Grant." 5. A secret in the sewing circle, the Thursday knitting group, met again that week, though the air was heavier than usual. The women knitted, whispered, and cast glances at one another like cautious players in a game. Mrs. Larkin began. "I had tea with Mrs. Carter yesterday. You know, the one who claims her husband knew Mrs. Dacres in London. She says she's remembered something interesting." Miss Marple looked up from her needles. "Indeed, she says she saw Mrs. Dacres arguing with someone in the churchyard last week, a man tall with a dark overcoat. That must have been before her death." Mrs. Penhaligon murmured. Miss Marple's knitting stilled for an instant. "And did she say who this man was?" Mrs. Larkin lowered her voice. She thought it was Colonel Bristow. There was a collective gasp. "Oh, but the Colonel is such a respectable man," said Mrs. Penhaligon. "Surely not." Miss Marple said nothing. Her needles clicked again, but slower, more deliberate. "Respectability," she murmured, "is a garment easily mended or torn." 6. The inspector returns 2 days later. Inspector Cray returned from London, his coat damp with rain and his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he said as she offered him tea, "I've been looking into Mrs. Dacres' past. You were right, there's more to her story. She was connected to a man named Vincent Harlow, former stockbroker, in prison now for fraud." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And perhaps she was the thread that led to him." exactly. We think she was blackmailing his old associates quietly, of course. She may have been killed to keep her quiet. Or perhaps, Miss Marple mused, she decided to keep rather too much of her profit. Cray frowned. Possible, but the trouble is, we've no clear suspect. Colonel Bristow had debts years ago, but no link to Harlow. Mr. Grant might have known of her finances, but why risk his career? Mrs. Carter, well, she's a gossip, but hardly a killer. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You underestimate the power of gossip, Inspector. It can ruin reputations more efficiently than any weapon. He gave a rueful laugh. Then perhaps you'll help me again, Miss Marple. Between your knitting and my notebook, we might untangle this web yet. Of course, she said, eyes glinting. One must always finish what one starts, especially a piece of knitting. 7. The knitted clue that evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reviewing her thoughts. The footprints, the letter from London, the argument by the churchyard, the supposed accident. Her eyes fell upon the half-finished scarf in her lap, blue wool, smooth except for a single uneven stitch where she'd dropped a loop earlier. She smiled suddenly. A dropped stitch, she murmured. So easy to miss, and yet it unravels everything. She rose, took her shawl, and went out into the night toward Maple Lodge. The house stood silent. The maid, Alice, opened the door sleepily. "Oh, Miss Marple, what brings you? Forgive me, my dear. I left my handkerchief when I last called, I believe. May I just look about?" The girl led her into the sitting-room, where Mrs. Dacres's possessions were neatly boxed. Miss Marple's gaze wandered, then settled upon a knitting basket in the corner. It was not Mrs. Dacres's, but Alice's. Inside lay a ball of blue wool identical to the one Miss Marple used. "How odd," Miss Marple said softly. "You knit too, Alice." The girl flushed a bit. Mrs. Dacres gave me that wool last week. Said she didn't need it." "Indeed, and did she seem her usual self then?" Alice hesitated. "No, miss, she was jumpy. Said she'd had a visitor that he'd threatened her, but she wouldn't tell me who." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And she gave you this wool immediately after?" "Yes, miss." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Then I believe, my dear, that you hold a most important clue in your knitting basket." 8. Quiet reflections later, as Miss Marple walked home through the still village. The church clock struck 11. Her thoughts ran as neatly as her stitches. The blue wool, the argument, the debts, the letter marked urgent. Each thread connected subtly, almost invisibly to one person. Someone who had access to Mrs. Dacres's papers. Someone who knew her financial secrets. Someone with charm enough to hide fear behind a smile. She paused at her garden gate, looking toward the faint lights of the solicitor's office down the lane. "Yes," she whispered softly, "a dropped stitch indeed." The March fog hung over Little Daring like a heavy curtain. In the stillness of the village, even the church bell seemed subdued, as if reluctant to break the hush that followed a tragedy. Yet beneath that calm exterior, whispers stirred like restless ghosts. By now, nearly everyone had a theory about Mrs. Dacres's death, and as Miss Marple knew only too well, the more people speculated, the further the truth tended to retreat like a shy cat avoiding notice. 1. The return of the gossip on Thursday afternoon. The knitting circle reconvened at the Vicarage. Mrs. Larkin, presiding from her armchair, poured tea with a slightly trembling hand. "I dare say it will be a relief to get back to normal," she sighed. "So much unpleasantness in one's own village, it quite spoils one's digestion." "Normal," said Mrs. Penhaligon, sniffing delicately, "is a word that means quite different things depending on who says it. And I assure you, Agatha, we're far from normal. Did you hear about Colonel Bristow?" Mrs. Larkin's teapot froze midair. "What of him?" His gardener, Jenkins, swears he saw the Colonel burn something in his fireplace 2 nights ago, papers, by the look of it, and after that argument he supposedly had with Mrs. Dacres, one does wonder, dear me, said Miss Marple mildly, her needles flashing. Perhaps the Colonel had old bank statements to dispose of. Men can be oddly sentimental about burning things. Mrs. Larkin leaned closer. But that's not all. Jenkins says he found a woman's handkerchief near the Colonel's greenhouse, initialed S.D. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. How very careless of Mrs. Dacres, if indeed it was hers. The room fell silent, save for the faint clinking of teaspoons and the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock. Each woman seemed to be turning over the same thought. What did the Colonel have to hide? 2. The Colonel's confession that evening. Miss Marple found herself once again at Hawthorne Cottage. The Colonel, when he opened the door, looked rather as though he had not slept in days. Miss Marple, he exclaimed, moustache bristling. I suppose you've heard the latest nonsense. They're saying I had a row with the poor woman. Utter rot. I'm sure it is, Miss Marple said gently, but you see, rumours are like dandelion seeds. Once loosed, one can never quite catch them again. He sighed and gestured her inside. I did see her that evening briefly. She stopped me in the lane, asked if I could lend her a revolver. A revolver? Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. How curious. Quite, said she wanted it for protection. Naturally I refused. I told her the very idea was absurd. She was nervous, agitated. I thought perhaps she'd had too much to drink. Did she mention who or what she feared? No, only said, he won't leave me alone. Then she walked off. I swear that's the last I saw of her. Miss Marple studied him quietly. Colonel, would you say Mrs. Dacres was the sort of woman who could handle fear well? Handle it? He frowned. She was brave in her way, but vain. She liked her comforts. I can't see her wandering by the river at night unless she was meeting someone. Miss Marple nodded. No, indeed. Thank you, Colonel. You've been most helpful. As she left, the Colonel called after her, Miss Marple, do you think they'll try to pin this on me? She smiled kindly. Not if the truth is as solid as your conscience, Colonel. But as she walked away through the mist, her expression was grave. The Colonel had revealed something new. Mrs. Dacres had feared a man, and if her fear had led her to that riverbank, then her death was no accident. 3. The solicitor's unease the following morning. Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Mr. Lionel Grant, the solicitor. His usual smooth charm seemed dimmed by fatigue. Miss Marple, I can't stay long, but I thought perhaps you should know someone's broken into my office. Miss Marple set down her teacup. How distressing. Was anything taken? He hesitated. A file. Mrs. Dacres's file, to be exact. The one containing her correspondence and will. How very singular. Miss Marple said softly. And when did this occur? Last night, sometime after 10. The police are looking into it. Probably just a common thief, though why anyone would want that particular file is beyond me. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Beyond you, perhaps, but not beyond those who might wish to hide something written in it. He frowned. You think this ties to her death? Oh, Mr. Grant, I seldom think. I simply notice, and I have noticed that trouble often begins when people underestimate the value of paper. Mr. Grant forced a smile, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his hat. I'll leave you to your observations, Miss Marple. When he was gone, she murmured to herself, a missing file, a frightened woman, and a solicitor who hides fear behind courtesy. How very telling. 4. The maid's second story that afternoon, Miss Marple once again called upon Alice, the maid at Maple Lodge. The girl had grown pale and anxious, clutching her apron as though it might shield her from memory. Oh, Miss Marple, she said, I keep thinking I hear her, Mrs. Dacres. Last night there were footsteps outside my window. Most likely the constable on patrol, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "But tell me, when you saw her speaking with that man at the gate, are you certain you couldn't make out his face?" Alice bit her lip. "No, miss, but I remember something else now. He gave her a small parcel." "A parcel?" "Yes, wrapped in brown paper. She took it inside and locked the parlour door. The next day she went to the post office, and I saw her give Mrs. Phelps a letter to London." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. So the circle widens. Before she left, Miss Marple asked quietly, "Did you ever see Mrs. Dacres with any medicines or powders?" The girl shook her head. "No, miss, but she did have a little silver flask she used to keep by her bedside." "Thank you, Alice. You've been very helpful indeed." As Miss Marple walked home, a suspicion began knitting itself together in her mind. A silver flask, a nervous woman, a letter to London, and a parcel which might have contained anything from documents to poison. 5. A strange accident that evening. Another commotion disturbed the village calm. Constable Pratt knocked on Miss Marple's door, breathless and pale. "There's been an accident, Miss Marple, down near the Vicarage road. A horse spooked and nearly ran down Mrs. Carter." Miss Marple took her shawl at once. "Oh dear, is she badly hurt?" "No, just shaken. But here's the queer part. The horse belonged to Colonel Bristow, and its reins were cut clean through." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Cut, you say? Not frayed?" "No, ma'am, sliced neat as butter. Someone meant mischief, that's for certain." "And Mrs. Carter, why was she on the Vicarage road at night?" Pratt looked embarrassed. "Said she was going to see Mrs. Larkin, but Mrs. Larkin says she knew nothing about it." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured. "Then perhaps Mrs. Carter was on her way to see someone else." A pattern was forming of fear, deceit, and now attempted violence. Someone in Little Daring was growing desperate. 6. A revelation at the church the next morning was Sunday. The villagers filed into church under a pale spring sun. The pews were full, yet the atmosphere felt strained. Eyes darted, whispers fluttered, and the faint smell of damp hymn books mingled with unease. Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded, observing. Colonel Bristow avoided Mr. Grant's gaze. Mrs. Carter dabbed her eyes dramatically. Even Mrs. Larkin's hymn singing was subdued. When the service ended, Inspector Cray appeared at the door, grim-faced. "If I might have a word with you, Miss Marple." They stepped outside, where the spring air was sharp. "We've traced that letter Mrs. Dacres sent before she died," he said. "It went to a man named Vincent Harlow, the fraudster, but it was returned unopened. He's still in prison." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Then she wasn't blackmailing him, she was warning him. Cray frowned. Warning him of what? That someone else was doing the blackmailing. She said softly, someone close enough to her to know the details of his crimes, perhaps even through her. Cray rubbed his chin. The solicitor, or someone who had access to his papers. Miss Marple replied, "Perhaps the same person who took the file from Mr. Grant's office." He looked startled. "But who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Patience, Inspector. We must not tug the wool before it's ready to unravel." 7. The trap is set that evening. Miss Marple invited a few of her neighbours for tea. Mrs. Larkin, Mrs. Penhaligon, Colonel Bristow, and Mr. Grant. The fire crackled merrily, and Miss Marple's voice was as calm as ever. "I thought we might all find comfort in one another's company after such troubling weeks," she said. "Do help yourselves to cake." They chatted politely, though the air was thick with unspoken tension. It was Mr. Grant who broke the veneer first. "Inspector Cray tells me you've been assisting him," he said with a brittle smile. "Perhaps you'll solve this mystery for us, Miss Marple." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," she said modestly. "But sometimes patterns appear where least expected. Like this, for example." She lifted the knitting basket beside her chair and drew out the blue wool Alice had been given. Curious, isn't it? This wool was Mrs. Dacres's. She gave it away the day before her death." Mr. Grant's expression flickered. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Oh, but it does," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, this wool was bought from your own sister's shop in London, a very distinctive dye, known only to her customers, and the receipt for it was found in Mrs. Dacres's missing file." Mr. Grant's composure faltered. "That's absurd, is it? Then perhaps you can explain how the file came to be stolen from your office last night, when you yourself were the only one with a key." Colonel Bristow stared. Mrs. Larkin gasped. Mr. Grant rose abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this." But Miss Marple's voice stopped him cold. "You see, Mr. Grant, Mrs. Dacres discovered that you were the one blackmailing Harlowe's old associates. She meant to expose you. You came to her that night, pretending to make amends, but when she threatened to write to the police, you pushed her by the riverbank. The silver flask you gave her, the one laced with brandy, clouded her senses just enough to make it look like a fall." A dreadful silence filled the room. Mr. Grant's face turned ashen. "You've no proof?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, but I have something even better understanding. You see, you dropped a small button from your coat that night. The constable found it in the mud near the footprints." He stared at her for a long moment, then slumped back into his chair. "She wouldn't stop," he muttered. "She said she'd ruin me." Inspector Cray stepped from the doorway, having listened quietly to the entire exchange. "That'll do, Mr. Grant." 8. The final stitch later that night, when peace returned to the village, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire. The blue wool lay neatly rolled beside her. Sergeant the cat purred contentedly, unaware that justice had been quietly restored. Mrs. Larkin would later tell everyone how Miss Marple had known from the very start. Colonel Bristow returned to his roses. Mrs. Penhaligon declared she'd never again trust a charming man with dimples, and Little Daring, after all its whispers, sank back into its comfortable rhythm of knitting and gossip, now with one more story to tell. Miss Marple smiled as she picked up her needles. "There now," she murmured, "every stitch accounted for, every thread in its place." Outside, the wind rustled through the hedges, carrying away the last echo of deceit. And in the quiet heart of the English countryside, order as always was restored. The next morning dawned with a pale wash of gold over the village rooftops, softening the hedgerows and drying the last of the evening dew. Little Daring, ever sensitive to scandal, had woken to the news that Lionel Grant, solicitor and respected gentleman, was now in police custody. From the baker's shop to the post office, conversation simmered. Everyone had known that something was amiss with Mrs. Dacres, her heirs, her visitors, her curious friendships, but no one had quite expected murder. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table with her usual calmness, nibbling toast and reading the Times. She looked serene, but her eyes betrayed a mind still at work. For though Lionel Grant had confessed, something about the confession so sudden, so pat unsettled her. A doubt in the quiet she had learned long ago that criminals often confessed to half-truths. They offered enough to seem guilty, but not enough to reveal the entire picture. Miss Marple folded her paper and rose. "There are knots yet unpicked," she murmured. Outside, the lanes glistened faintly from last night's drizzle. She walked to Maple Lodge, the late Mrs. Dacres's house, now under police seal. Constable Pratt stood by the gate, hat slightly askew, looking pleased to see her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Can't imagine what you'd want here now it's all settled." "Ah, but that's just it, Constable," she said kindly. "Nothing is ever truly settled until all the threads lie straight. I should like a word with Inspector Cray, if I may." She found the inspector in the study, going over notes. He looked tired but satisfied. "Morning, Miss Marple. I must say, you've done half my work for me. The man broke down completely last night. We've his statement and the motive. Case closed. I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, glancing about the room. "Forgive an old woman's fussiness, but I can't help feeling something is amiss." "How so?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a woman with keen eyes and an elegant pose. "Tell me, Inspector, who is this lady?" "That's Mrs. Dacres' sister. Died years ago, I'm told." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Indeed. Yet look, the photograph is new. The frame, the glass, all quite recent." Cray frowned. "You think it was replaced?" "Not replaced," she said thoughtfully, added, "and that suggests to me that Mrs. Dacres had someone or something she was trying to remember, or perhaps remind someone else of." The inspector rubbed his temples. "I'm not sure I follow, nor am I certain yet," Miss Marple admitted, "but I believe Mr. Grant may not have acted alone. Too, a visit to Mrs. Carter to confirm her suspicion. Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Carter. She found her neighbour reclining dramatically on the sofa, a silk scarf about her neck and a cup of tea balanced precariously on one knee. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "I was nearly killed, you know. That dreadful horse, it's left me shaken to the very soul." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "one does wonder how its reins came to be cut." Mrs. Carter's hand trembled. "Oh, I couldn't say. It must have been mischief." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, taking a seat. "Tell me, Mrs. Carter, you were once quite close with Mrs. Dacres, were you not?" Mrs. Carter's lips pursed. "Once, perhaps, before she became difficult." "Meaning she no longer wished to confide in you?" Mrs. Carter bristled. "If she didn't, it was her loss. I was only trying to help her. She'd been acting queerly, sending letters, locking herself in her parlour, making telephone calls at odd hours. I worried for her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet, the night before she died, you told Mrs. Larkin you'd seen her by the river with a man. How very observant of you to be out walking so late." Colour rose in Mrs. Carter's cheeks. "I was visiting a friend." "Oh, yes, Mrs. Larkin, who insists you never came." Miss Marple's tone was as mild as ever. "You see, my dear, it strikes me that your walk was rather deliberate. And when you saw Mrs. Dacres, you were not merely watching, you were waiting." Mrs. Carter's teacup rattled against its saucer. "That's outrageous. Perhaps, yet you've been frightened ever since, so frightened that someone cut those reins to silence you." There was a long pause. Mrs. Carter's painted lips trembled. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "But I did see who did." 3. The name in the letter. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes calm and encouraging. "Go on, Mrs. Carter." "It wasn't Mr. Grant who pushed her," the woman said shakily. "He was there, yes, but someone else came after. I saw her fall, but he didn't push her. It was—" She stopped suddenly, clutching her throat. "Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple prompted gently. The woman looked terrified. "If I tell you, he'll know. He always knows." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "You are quite safe, my dear. The truth loses its power to harm once it is spoken." After a long silence, Mrs. Carter whispered, "It was Colonel Bristow." Miss Marple's eyes did not widen, nor did she flinch. Instead, she simply nodded, as though confirming a suspicion long held. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've done the right thing." 4. The Colonel's motive that afternoon. Miss Marple went again to Hawthorne Cottage. The Colonel received her in his study, a fire crackling merrily behind him. He looked composed, perhaps too composed. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to gloat. Grant behind bars and all that." "I've come to ask you a few small questions," she said, removing her gloves. "About Mrs. Dacres." The Colonel's expression flickered. "I've told everything I know." "Yes, I imagine you have," Miss Marple replied, "but not, perhaps, everything that matters. You see, I believe Mrs. Dacres knew something about you, something you would have preferred to keep private." He gave a short laugh. Good heavens, what nonsense! Oh, I don't think so. Miss Marple continued gently. You see, her letter to London wasn't a blackmail attempt at all. It was a confession she meant to name the person who had been threatening her. The Colonel stiffened. Threatening her? Yes, you. Miss Marple's tone was as light as if discussing a parish bake sale. You were in debt, were you not? Your investments failed, and Mrs. Dacres, with her taste for gossip and her knowledge of local affairs, knew precisely whom you owed. He stared at her. You can't prove that. No, said Miss Marple. But perhaps I can prove something else. When Mrs. Dacres received that parcel, the one the maid saw it contained a letter of credit, drawn up in your handwriting. She meant to give it to Mr. Grant for safekeeping. When you learned of it, you followed her to the river. You found her already weak from the brandy Mr. Grant had provided, and when she stumbled, you made sure she did not rise again. Bristow's face drained of colour. You've no evidence. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Evidence is often overrated, Colonel. Motive and opportunity, however, are as plain as day, and I fear the mud on your boots that night contained flecks of the same blue wool Mrs. Dacres had been knitting wool that never left her hands. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, the bravado melted from his face. She ruined me, he said hoarsely. I begged her to keep silent. She laughed, said she'd expose me at the fete. I only meant to frighten her. She slipped, I swear it. Miss Marple sighed softly. They often do, Colonel, slip, that is. But one rarely falls without a push, whether by hand or by conscience. 5. The inspector's surprise when Miss Marple told Inspector Cray what she had learned. He was incredulous. You're saying Grant and Bristow were involved, together, in a manner of speaking, she said. Mr. Grant sought money, and the Colonel sought silence. Mrs. Dacres became the unfortunate bridge between them, one manipulating, the other desperate. Cray exhaled slowly. I'll be hanged. You're right, of course. The Colonel's been dodging his bills for years. Still, I'll need a confession. You'll have it. Miss Marple said serenely, men who talk of honour seldom bear its weight long. And she was right. That evening, Colonel Bristow came to the station, hat in hand, and surrendered himself. 6. Miss Marple reflects that night. Little Daring was quieter than it had been in weeks. From her sitting room window, Miss Marple watched the lamps flicker out one by one across the village. She thought of Mrs. Dacres vain, foolish, yet not undeserving of pity, of Lionel Grant, clever enough to destroy himself, and of Colonel Bristow, undone not by wickedness alone, but by pride. Human frailty, she mused, was like her knitting full of knots, loose ends and threads that refused to lie straight. It took patience, understanding, and a gentle hand to untangle them. She set aside her knitting and poured herself a small cup of tea. The steam rose in elegant curls, catching the lamplight. People, she murmured, are so very alike wherever one goes. In St. Mary Mead or Little Daring, it is always vanity, greed, and fear that make up the pattern, and love or conscience that must mend it. Sergeant, the cat blinked sleepily from the hearthrug, as if agreeing. Outside, the church bell tolled 9, a solemn, steady sound. Justice, Miss Marple thought, was never loud or vengeful. It was quiet, inevitable, like the click of knitting needles in the dark. Morning in Little Daring broke with a fragile peace, the kind that follows a storm. Mist drifted across the meadows, and the church bell rang softly over the rooftops, as though blessing the village for enduring yet another brush with wickedness. Inside her sitting-room, Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting needles glinting in the slanting light. A fresh cup of Darjeeling steamed beside her, and on the hearthrug, Sergeant the cat purred as if all were right again. But Miss Marple, ever honest with herself, knew that the restoration of peace was never quite so simple. Human nature, she reflected, was like her knitting. One must never assume a pattern was perfect until the final stitch was cast off. And so, before she could rest easy, there remained one last duty: to bring understanding to those left bewildered, and order to hearts still troubled by suspicion. 1. The gathering at the vicarage. The vicar, ever eager to heal wounded spirits, had invited several neighbours to the vicarage parlour that afternoon, ostensibly for tea, though everyone knew it was to hear the truth. The room buzzed with restrained curiosity. Mrs. Larkin presided near the teapot. Mrs. Penhaligon arranged a plate of currant scones. Mrs. Carter, her nerves still delicate, fluttered her lace handkerchief. Even Inspector Cray attended, notebook tucked discreetly into his coat pocket. When Miss Marple entered, conversation hushed. She smiled gently, her presence quiet but commanding. "My dear friends," she said, "I thought it might be well to explain how the dreadful business of Mrs. Dacres came to its unhappy conclusion. There are, I think, certain misunderstandings to be untangled." Mrs. Larkin nodded solemnly. "Indeed, Miss Marple, we should all be very grateful for clarity. It's been most unsettling." "Quite," murmured Mrs. Penhaligon, eyes alight with curiosity. "I, for one, should like to know how such a respectable man as Mr. Grant could commit so ghastly an act." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag. "Ah, but you see, my dear, he did not act alone. The room drew breath as one, too. Miss Marple explains the web it began." Miss Marple continued softly, with a rather foolish woman, Mrs. Dacres, who delighted in gossip, and who believed she could manage other people's secrets as deftly as she managed her own. Unfortunately, secrets are rarely obedient. Mrs. Carter gave a small gasp. "She knew about the Colonel's debts, didn't she?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And worse, she had proof. A letter of credit drawn up by him which, had it been discovered, would have ruined his reputation. Mr. Grant, who handled her financial affairs, learned of this document and saw in it an opportunity. He had already been tampering with the accounts of several clients. A dangerous business, and Mrs. Dacres's knowledge made her a liability, so he sought to use her for his own ends." Inspector Cray leaned forward slightly. "The blackmail letters." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Grant persuaded Mrs. Dacres to write letters to the associates of a certain imprisoned swindler, Mr. Harlow, letters which he himself dictated. She believed she was doing a favour for her solicitor. In reality, he was extorting money through her hand. When she realized this, she threatened to expose him, and that's when he gave her the poisoned brandy," murmured Mrs. Penhaligon. "Why, died, not poison, my dear," Miss Marple corrected gently. "A mild sedative, enough to confuse and slow her. He intended to frighten her into silence, not kill her. Unfortunately, she sought help elsewhere from Colonel Bristow, whose own desperation made him dangerous." There was a soft murmur around the room. "Mrs. Dacres met the Colonel by the river that night," Miss Marple continued. "She had the letter of credit with her proof of his embezzlement. He pleaded with her to destroy it. When she refused, there was a struggle. The Colonel, in anger or fear, pushed her. She fell, struck her head, and the current did the rest. Mr. Grant, arriving moments later, believed she was already dead, and so removed her handbag and papers to conceal his own guilt." The vicar's wife gasped, hand to her chest. "How dreadful! How very dreadful!" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But it is the way of wickedness. You see, it seldom travels alone. One sin invites another until the whole pattern unravels." 3. The village reacts. Silence followed, heavy and complete. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed to echo in the room. Mrs. Carter dabbed her eyes. "And to think, all this time I suspected poor Alice, the maid. I even told Mrs. Larkin she looked sly. Mrs. Larkin sniffed. "We all did, dear. It's perfectly natural to draw the wrong conclusions. That's what gossip does. It weaves its own little mysteries." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, indeed. Gossip is rather like knitting. A small mistake at the beginning may lead to an entirely different pattern at the end." Even Inspector Cray allowed himself a smile. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. If ever you tire of knitting, you might take a position in Scotland Yard." "Oh, no, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I should find the company far less interesting." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, easing the tension. For Justice and Mercy that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hedgerows, the official word came from the station. Colonel Bristow had confessed. Mr. Grant's role as accomplice was established. Both men would face trial in London. Little Daring, relieved and sorrowful in equal measure, began to resume its gentle rhythm. Curtains were drawn, kettles whistled, and soon the only voices left were those of the robins in the garden hedges. Miss Marple sat at her desk, writing a letter to an old friend in St. Mary Mead, perhaps to tell her that human folly was much the same wherever one went. She paused midway, pen in hand, and smiled faintly. In her mind she saw again Mrs. Dacres, foolish, vain, but not cruel, and thought of how easily a woman's small deceits might spiral into tragedy. Then she saw Colonel Bristow, a man brought down by pride, and Mr. Grant, undone by greed. Both men, she reflected, had been guilty of the same delusion, believing that appearances could hide truth. Yet truth, like a dropped stitch, always made itself known eventually. She sighed softly, folded the letter, and reached for her knitting. The blue wool gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its texture smooth and unbroken. Order restored, she murmured, and there was something serene in her tone, not triumph, but understanding. 5. Epilogue. The calm after weeks later, spring came to Little Daring. Daffodils pushed through the damp earth. The church choir rehearsed for Easter, and the knitting circle met once more at Mrs. Larkin's cosy parlour. The women talked as women do of gardens, recipes, and the latest sermon. But occasionally someone would glance toward Miss Marple, sitting serenely by the fire, and smile with quiet respect. "Remarkable woman," Mrs. Larkin would whisper, "knows everything before the rest of us even begin to suspect." Miss Marple only smiled, eyes lowered to her knitting. She never cared for praise. She found it interfered with concentration. As the fire crackled and tea was poured, Mrs. Penhaligon leaned over. "Miss Marple, do you ever tire of all this crime and wickedness?" "Oh, my dear," she said with her usual gentle humour, "I'm never tired, only occasionally saddened. But then I remind myself that there is goodness too, if one looks closely enough." Mrs. Penhaligon frowned thoughtfully. "Goodness after all that's happened?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the goodness that comes when truth is spoken, and when people learn, however painfully, to be honest with themselves. Even in tragedy there's something to be mended, just like one's knitting." And she returned to her work, the steady rhythm of her needles marking time with the ticking clock. Outside, the village bell rang 6. Children laughed down the lane. The scent of early roses drifted through the window. The storm had passed, and once again peace, true peace, had returned to Little Daring.